So and we'd like to record today's meeting. Thanks for remembering to do that. So we'll get going with the recording now. Um, and Charlotte, thanks for sharing your screen. I'm going to read what you all are writing, and I invite you to do the same, right? I'll do some quietly to myself, and maybe I'll say some as well, right? Bouncing back, a few of those, yep. Being flexible. I love the trusting relationships, diverse, interconnected, trusting relationships. Being prepared, successfully anticipating, fast, effective response. Great. Thanks everyone for putting these in. These are really interesting. If you're having a hard time with it, just let me know. Again, you can find that link from Charlotte in the chat. You just click on it and you can type a short phrase. Knowledge. Being able to live in harmony with natural systems like those rivers that like to expand their banks. Support mechanisms within communities. Reducing factors that contribute to flooding and other threats. Changing lifestyles. Great. See if a few more things jump in and then we'll finish up. Okay, great. So I want to thank everyone for introducing themselves in the chat. It's hard to see all this. I'm looking at when I look at the other screen here, it's because that's where I have my other Zoom screen. Thanks for everyone introducing themselves. Thanks for dropping some initial ideas in the chat. So we have today with us Secretary Julie Moore from the Agency of Natural Resources, as well as Treasurer Mike Pieciak, who together, the two of them, have launched this initiative around the resilience implementation strategy. I'm going to start with Secretary Moore. And we've asked both of them to say just a few words, no more than 5 minutes or so, of why this initiative and what it's trying to do. So Secretary Moore, let me turn it over to you, and then we'll go to the Treasurer.
Sure. Thank you very much, David, and thank you to everyone who has joined the call this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be part of this important conversation. As David mentioned, the Treasurer and the Governor announced a joint effort to develop a resilience implementation strategy at the beginning of this year. And this is really coming out of the devastating floods this past summer, but also other, I guess what I would describe as climate-related adversity that has really seemed to accelerate. And that includes things like the Canadian wildfires and the hazy skies and unsafe air quality experienced in Vermont this summer. Actually, it can be hard to remember, but immediately prior to the July floods, much of Vermont was in a state of significant drought that had extended through much of the spring and early summer. And we also know that the heavy wet snows we saw both at the beginning of 2023 and then again this winter created widespread and expensive power outages. And all of these are components of the different effects that climate change is having here in Vermont. It was also clear that coming out of that collective weight is a lot of sense of urgency about trying to do better, to become more resilient, to make important investments in adaptation, and that there is a lot of different pieces of this work being done across state government, but we hadn't brought that information together into a comprehensive strategy, hadn't looked at where our current strengths are and where gaps may exist, and frankly, what kind of revenue would be needed to support filling those gaps. And so that was the genesis for developing a resilience implementation strategy, pulling together the work that is already underway across Vermont, looking for those gaps, and then thinking about what the state's financial commitment needs to be. And maybe I can pause right there, David, and pass the talking stick over to Mike to talk a little bit about the financial components of the work.
Excellent.
Well, thanks, David, and thank you to Secretary Moore, and thank you for your leadership and ANR's leadership on this issue. I think that's exactly right. The financial piece is something that really made me eager to participate in this project. We know that Vermont has seen rising costs from a changing climate. The types of natural disasters that we're seeing fueled by climate change are increasing. They're increasing in their frequency and they're increasing in their impact. And that is costing municipalities, it's costing the state of Vermont, it's costing local businesses, it's costing families. And that is a big challenge for us. It's a big financial challenge. And trying to think about how do we muster all the financial resources that we need to be making investments ahead of time so that we can prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change here in Vermont are critical investments to avoiding much more significant costs down the road, and costs that will be reoccurring as well for communities and families and businesses. So that is really why I'm excited to participate. I also think it's really important for us in Vermont to have a resiliency strategy. We've done such good work on the climate front and thinking about how do we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and reduce our greenhouse gases. But we know that even if Vermont is perfect in that regard, the rest of the world is not, unfortunately, and we're going to see impacts from climate change. Some of them have already happened. Some of them have already been baked in. So we need to have a resiliency strategy to be able to deal with that over the next few decades. Hopefully, as a country and as a world community, we can avoid some of those worst impacts, but we know some of them are already going to be felt, and we need to be thinking about resiliency as well as reduction in greenhouse gases and the like. So appreciate everyone being here today. Look forward to today's engagement and this work more broadly. Thanks, David.
Thank you. All right. So that's what the leadership's thinking on this initiative. And we also, before we start to have a discussion about this, and we're going to, just as a flag, we're going to discuss in two ways. We're going to break into some somewhat smaller groups. We're 70 plus folks right now, so we're going to break into a few groups so we can have smaller conversations. Then we'll bring it all back together. Before we do that, Marion Walls, who works at the Climate Action Office in ANR, is going to walk us through some basics of, why do we need to be talking about this and how we might start to construct together a vision for what resilience means in the face of a changing climate in Vermont. So Marion, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Marion Walls. I'm the Resilience and Adaptation Coordinator at ANR's Climate Action Office. Excited to be with you all today to kick off the development of this resilience implementation strategy, share with you all the work plan we're looking at in developing this over the next 18 months, and really dive into a conversation with you all about what climate resilience means to you and how we can ensure that's woven into this strategy. Thanks also to Secretary Moore and Treasurer Pieciak for the introduction. So as a first step in this process and the focus of our conversation with you all today, we'd like to hear from you all about what climate resilience means to you in your communities, in your homes, and in the state. Building off what Secretary Moore and Treasurer Pieciak shared, we know the impacts of climate change are making storms more severe and frequent, but are also making things like droughts, invasive species, and extreme temperatures more regular occurrences. All of these impacts, from the storms to those slower moving hazards, impact our daily lives, our communities, and many of the things we value about Vermont. The work we're hoping to start with you all today through conversation will be to begin to craft a vision for what a resilient Vermont could look like. Crafting a vision for a climate resilient Vermont allows us to really describe a shared expression of aspirations and values that captures how the things that we love about Vermont can help us be more resilient in the face of climate change. It also allows us to shift our focus from the negative impacts of storms and droughts to the positive changes we'd like to see in Vermont that help us be more prepared and allow us to bounce back faster from the impacts of climate change. The vision we'll begin to develop with you all today will help guide us in the process of developing this resilience implementation strategy. It will be used to set criteria that will ultimately be used to prioritize the measures that are included in the strategy. And I'll be sharing more about the work plan to develop the strategy after our conversation at the end of the presentation today. So as we hear from you today to craft this vision, I did want to note we're not starting from scratch. Tropical Storm Irene in 2011 really started the conversation in Vermont about what it means to be resilient to climate change impacts. Since then, Vermont has made huge strides in developing programs and enacting policies that help us address the impacts of climate change. Much of this focus has been on flooding, as that's our #1 hazard, but as evidenced from last summer, as Secretary Moore spoke to, droughts, extreme heat, and wildfire smoke are some of the other impacts we're feeling. As we're not starting from scratch on developing this vision, nor are we starting from scratch on developing the overall strategy, we're in the process of conducting a literature review of other visioning events and conversations that have focused on climate resilience. Since the flooding last July, communities across the state have been holding conversations about what it means to be resilient. We want to capture those conversations and ideas in the strategy, so those ideas and experiences are really reflected in the vision we hope to develop with you all. We're also building off of other plans and documents. The State Hazard Mitigation Plan, Climate Action Plan, Comprehensive Energy Plan are just a few examples of statewide plans that help think about and address aspects of what it means to be resilient to climate impacts. As we have a conversation with you all today about what it means to be resilient, I did want to share a starting place for a vision. In 2012 and 2013, following Tropical Storm Irene, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, in partnership with Vermont state government, various agencies and departments, as well as nonprofit partners and Vermonters at large, developed something called the Resilient Vermont Project. This resulted in a set of recommendations and a vision that you can see on the screen here. It highlighted that Vermont, in order to be resilient, needs to be better prepared for climate shocks to our economy, our environment, our social well-being. It focused on reducing vulnerabilities and improving response and recovery, and highlighted the importance of what resilience is at a local, regional, and state level, which is one of the key things we're going to dig in with you all today. The report concluded also with an acknowledgement that a vision crafted for a resilient Vermont in 2013 will need to change as we continue to adapt, as new collaborations arise, and as we are impacted by new disasters. As it has now been 11 years since that report was developed, we'd like to use it as a starting point for our discussion, but acknowledge that a lot has changed. We've implemented new plans and programs, we've welcomed new people to our state, and want to ensure that a vision for a climate resilient Vermont reflects the values of Vermonters today and helps inform the development of the strategy. So hopefully that's a starting place for our conversation today, and I'll hand it back to you, David, to introduce our small group session.
Thank you. Great. Okay. I will note it is lunchtime here, and it's totally okay if someone needs a snack while we keep going here. All right. So we are going to do a couple rounds of conversation to talk about this vision, right? What does it mean for us in Vermont to be resilient in the face of a changing climate? We're going to do that first, as I mentioned, in some smaller groups. They're still going to be relatively large because we're a big group here today. And then we're going to come back and do it all together. And when we end up the meeting, we're going to ask Secretary Moore and Treasurer Pieciak to reflect on some of the things they're hearing. The other thing that you can expect from us is a meeting summary to come out of this meeting and the one we did on Monday, so that you can see what it is that the state is taking away from these initial conversations as it tries to work with Vermonters in defining resilience and making a plan. The specific question that we're going to work on, I'm going to drop in the chat right now just to sort of signal it. It looks like this. Hang on one second. In your lifetime and in your children's lifetime, how would you like to see your family, your community, and your state be more resilient to climate change? And it's intentional to talk about these different levels, and Marion mentioned it as well, right? This level of your household, your family is one level. What does it mean to be resilient there? Your community, where you, the sort of neighborhood, community, however you want to define that. And then more broadly, what does the state need to be doing from a state standpoint, a policy standpoint? We want to talk about all those levels and hear your views about it. Okay, so either I or Sophie Veltrop from the Climate Action Office, or Marion, who you've already met, or Ashlyn Doyen from the Treasurer's Office will be facilitating these conversations. And Charlotte, how are we looking for sending us out for 15 minutes to have the conversation?
Already.
Okay, so we'll do this for 15 minutes. We'll come on back. You can always click the leave conversation button if you need to come back to the main room, if you need help from Charlotte on something. So Charlotte, go ahead. We'll see you all in the rooms. By the way, click join. If you get an alert, click join. That way you can head into your room. Hey folks, sorry about that if you got pulled back right in the middle of a sentence. In my group, I didn't quite help navigate that well. So Bronwyn, sorry about that. And as you sentence. Okay, welcome back. I hope that was a good set of conversations. Certainly one that I was part of was. What we thought we'd do now is a quick debrief, and I'm going to do that with the facilitators, and then we'll open it up to everybody. And so facilitators, help me out here. Maybe I'll turn to you, Sophie, first. What's sort of one thing that really jumped out of the many things you talked about, but one that really jumped out is a key piece of this vision of resilience?
Let's see. Oh gosh, there were so many wonderful things that folks put forward. There was this big picture comment about there are so many hardworking individuals and smaller organizations doing great work related to this, and that we might do well to overlap and overlay and coordinate those efforts together, and that simplifying, especially statewide systems and funding, can help to streamline some of the things that and make it easier for individuals and smaller groups to get involved at a more regional or statewide level.
Nice. Thanks, Sophie. Did other groups get to this piece of like, wow, there's a lot of different people working on this? Our group certainly mentioned a question like, how is this going to coordinate and be complementary to all the hazard mitigation work? Did other groups, Ashlyn or Indra or Marion, deal with this issue of overlapping work?
We did touch on this a little bit in the vein of sort of the need for more accessible collaboration and coordination at a statewide level, and particularly the need to have that those efforts be accessible to entities at the community level, like municipalities or planning commissions and things like that. And so we heard about that topic at 2 levels of the question.
Nice. That's great. Others on this topic, Indra, was this something that came up in your conversations?
I don't think we explicitly talked about it, but we did talk about like how the impacts are multifaceted, and RPC can create a plan in order to mitigate, can create town plan. But what if the towns don't have the capital plan, and when the disaster hits, we really need to focus on building up the capital and the infrastructure. And if the towns are not required to do that, how is that going to work? So we did touch on the multifaceted nature of it.
That's great. Marion, in your conversation, what's one thing that really jumped out among the many things?
Yeah, among the many things, I think a key theme for our group was really thinking about local capacity and volunteer capacity. There was an acknowledgement that a lot of the great work that's happening on the ground to conserve our lands, to ensure we have clean water to drink and swim and sort of and live by, is really supported on the backs of volunteer efforts. And there was an acknowledgement that, that's what makes Vermont special, is this sort of local drive and locally driven organizations, but in the same vein can make it very challenging to build resilient systems and structures as we start to feel more cascading impacts of climate change. So there was a lot of discussion around sort of systems support that the state can prioritize, thinking about how to sort of support localized self-sustaining networks, acknowledging that resilience is really felt at the local level, but it can be very challenging for municipalities with limited capacity or other organizations to kind of carry that work.
Thanks, Marion. That's great. And then from our group, I would say, two things. One is focusing on a very household level. There's an initial comment that we worked on, which was, the most important thing is if something happens, knowing where to go, right? If you can't be in your house, where to go. And if you need a vision there of where to go for help, where to go to live. And those are key household issues. Folks also raised up the issue that forest fires are not typically seen as a big hazard in Vermont, but you need to be careful that may become a hazard in the future. The other thing that was interesting in our group, I'll mention, is a focus on systems, right? How does Vermont have the systems and structures in place together with the skill sets and the funding to make this work? And so real sort of systems look at, where is the vulnerability? How do we have systems in place to address those vulnerabilities? Let me circle back one more time to facilitators. What's something else we haven't mentioned already that came up in the groups that would be helpful to lift up right now? Maybe I'll start with you, Indra. Was there something else you think would be helpful to put out in there in the full group right now?
Yeah, I think going back to what you said, Marianne, right? Like maintaining the basic infrastructure at all times. Natural disasters are not a surprise anymore, right? Like communities can come together. We specifically talked about Montpelier and Barre, Central Vermont flooding. Communities can come together and help one another to clean out the basement. But is the government prepared, knowing that climate change is not a surprise anymore? How do we stay prepared at the time of crisis, just so that our basic infrastructures are running and we are prepared in order to mitigate those? That was one of the other things. And in terms of community, really engaging all of our communities into this conversation, creating awareness around the issue is crucial, because without that awareness, it becomes really challenging to come together as a community. So those were two things.
Nice. Love it. Sophie, other things that were jumping out in your group that you might be helpful to put on the table right now? There you go.
Yes. Let's see. I'll try and name one that maybe hasn't come up so far. We heard about education as having an opportunity there to integrate a lot more education, whether that's directly to households after flooding or through public schools.
Nice.
And the resilience hubs also came up in our group. Heating and cooling centers, and I appreciated somebody talking about the importance of integrating food security as part of those resilience hubs.
Oh, nice. Okay, great. So education outreach, resilience hubs. Excuse me, something in my throat. Ashlyn, other things in your group that you'd like to lift up?
Sure. Similar to Sophie, I'll share something that I had not heard, I think, in the meeting earlier this week, and that is children's mental health and the need to possibly be integrating a response to children's mental health into our climate action.
Nice. Love it. Marion, are there other things in your group that be helpful to lift up right now?
Yeah, one key point that resonated with a lot of our group members was really just a continued focus on increasing equity and inclusion and amplifying voices to be part of this conversation who haven't in the past. And, not only doing that at an individual and community level, but ensuring that the state supports that and has the structures in place to really change how we kind of hold these conversations about what it means to be resilient, because that can mean different things to different people.
That's great. I'll throw in one more thing and then let's open it up to everybody here in the call. But one more thing from our group that I thought came across from more than one person was really thinking about not doubling down on the mistakes of the past and learning how to live with natural environment, with rivers in particular. And so there's a piece of work for Vermont in understanding the future of that. Okay. Folks, I've been enjoying the chat. Thanks for putting ideas in the chat. I welcome if folks want to raise their hand. If there are things you haven't heard in this quick debrief that we just did amongst ourselves as facilitators, you want to raise up, feel free to raise your hand. Happy to do a sort of more informal conversation now amongst us all. So things you'd like to say, important aspects of a vision for resilience. I see a phone number with a hand up. Go right ahead.
Hi. Yeah, just my name's Matthew. I'm calling as a part of a intentional community in Orleans County, and I think the biggest question, point, comment to make from my side would be kind of massaging and developing the relationship with landowners for land management, so that people aren't not calling the state Department of Ag or Natural Resources because they're afraid of some land being designated as a wetland or something that would prevent them. I think they want collaboration and support. So I would say kind of looking at how to make that an open door and create programs so that people can come and be partners in land development. And, of course, in terms of water management and carbon and all of that.
Nice. Thanks for the comment. Yeah.
Yep. You're welcome.
Cheryl Joy, welcome.
Hi. Yeah, something that came up in our group as well is what you just brought up, David, about rivers and streams, but also all natural processes, including wetlands that the caller just brought up. And another thing that I don't think I heard everybody talk about in this big group is that we should not be, that we also talked about in our group, really focused on wood burning. We shouldn't be making things worse, and it's a little bit of a conundrum that the emissions aren't counted from burning wood, and it's one of the it's one of the worst things to do, and yet we are encouraging it to increase in Vermont. So we should really pay attention to that. Of course, thinking about equity, it's a really hot topic, and there's a lot to say about it. But that is another thing, is to not make things worse while in trying to change the way we do things. We shouldn't be making things worse.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay. Other work here. I see some interesting stuff in the chat. If folks want to elaborate on that, about the Resilience Hub's work, and how to make that successful. If folks want to chime in on that, I'd be happy to hear a little bit more about that. And the comments around procurement, binning public infrastructure projects together and using economies of scale. If there's other things folks want to say about that, feel free to raise your hand. Anything else? Bronwyn?
Hi, I just thought I would finish a thought that I had in the group, because if I don't
Please
finish
do.
it, I'll forget about it. So I guess I just wanted to finish a thought that we were having in our group, which is that, we were talking about some sort of, community, regional, statewide conversation around river restoration, not doubling down on the things we've done in the past, those types of conversations. And it had me thinking a lot about how important it is to really provide space and support for community level conversations and even community visualizing of like, what is it that we're really talking about when we say these things? Because I think everybody, and we were also talking about, well, if that's something that's happening at the community level and the state level, you know, what does that look like, bringing it down to a property level? And it had me thinking about a lot of the conversations we've had around housing and how, you know, you can talk broadly about housing and the fact that we, you know, might be interested in more infill development and density. And a lot of times you'll go into a community and there's just this visceral reaction because people in the community are imagining like New York City, right? And so you'll be trying to have this conversation and using similar language, but people are having very different ideas about what that looks like on the ground. So I just wanted to, I guess, flag that this thought that I had is that it's really important to be having these conversations in a community to talk about what does it look like to allow a river to flow over into some areas. What does it look like to do hardening or not do hardening in areas? And just make sure that people are talking about similar things as opposed to imagining the worst and kind of shutting down immediately.
Right.
So
And the
that was
importance
the thought
of,
that I was having.
thanks, Bronwyn. And the importance of visuals in that, right? The importance, yeah, helping people literally see. Yeah, that's great. Jennifer?
Yeah, building off of what was said about working with natural systems, I mean, healthy soils just have an incredible capacity to hold water, and we have so much farmland bordering waterways. I know many Vermont farmers are working towards increasing their soil health, but I think it really should be more of a focus. You know, the 1% increase in soil organic matter can hold 25,000 gallons of water per acre. So we're not talking about huge increases that can improve our resiliency. And then just throw something out about microgrids because I hadn't heard anyone mention it, but
Yeah. Okay, great. So the two pieces there, just to be clear, one is around improving our soil health actually helps water retention as well. And then the microgrids is, I guess, a plug about if we're able to make our grid more resilient through smaller scale pieces, we may be more resilient overall. Okay, great. Will Pitkin.
Hi. So microgrids, I think, are a great thing. I think finding overlap between different solutions, but also being realistic about budget constraints, and especially as they're going to probably get much worse in the coming years due to the impacts of climate change, and trying to figure out, I mean, the whole point of this is figuring out what are the biggest priorities and that have the most impact. And so like, I think of the biggest dangers, not a comprehensive list, being flooding, roads going out, and electric grids going out. And I guess the big question is like, do we really think that we can stop climate change as Vermont, as individuals, as communities? And given budget constraints, wouldn't the energy and the money that goes into attempting to stop climate change be better spent on attempting to prepare ourselves for its impacts? And maybe that is renewable energy, like in resilience hubs, microgrids for when the bigger grid goes out. But obviously want all of the solutions, but trying to figure out, accepting that not all of them can happen. I think that the time and energy that goes in, and money that goes into stopping climate change will be better spent preparing for it.
Thanks, Will. All right. Other thoughts, reactions about what makes for a resilient Vermont in the face of a changing climate? And I appreciate folks' comments in the chat. We can pull those into a meeting summary as well. Okay. All right. So one of the things we wanted to do, feel free if you raise your hand or throw something else in the chat. One of the things we wanted to do was ask Secretary Moore and Treasurer Pieciak if they're still with us. I'm just checking if they are. If they're able to provide some reflections about what they're hearing. I see Secretary Moore. Secretary Moore, when you're hearing this conversation, what are some of the things that are jumping out, particularly as it relates to, where you hope this initiative goes?
Sure. First, just I want to reflect how grateful I am for everyone's input. It's striking to me the diversity of opinions and perspectives we've heard here today, but also having had the benefit of participating in Monday night session as well, where we received another significant range of input, and some different topics sort of rose to the top for me today. Maybe no surprise, the conversation around the importance of natural systems, healthy soils, and nature-based solutions, and lots of different facets of that work is obviously central to the Agency of Natural Resources, but was pleased to hear it pop up in a number of different facets today. And again, just grateful to everyone for taking time to be part of these conversations. It's really helpful to us as we start to build out our plan for developing the resilience strategy.
Nice. Thanks. I'm just checking quickly if Mike is still here. I think
David?
Oh, yep. Oh, you are. Great. Sorry about that.
No, it's a lot of squares.
Yeah.
Um,
Things that jumped out at you as you're hearing this conversation?
Yeah, I think two things. One, three things. I think just the amount of engagement and, people wanting to lean into solutions, very specific ideas, very broad ideas. I think that's really great to hear both in the breakout session and, more globally. I think it's also interesting just to hear, that wrestling with, how do we prevent climate change versus how do we mitigate against its worst impacts? I think that's a balance that, all states will struggle with to some degree, but particularly Vermont, where we're seeing the impacts and we're a relatively small polluter given everything else going on in the country and the world. And then just, finally, it's everybody's time and showing up to this is, really valuable and gives us good insight as to the direction we should go with this project, very early on in sort of its early days. So that is, that's also very much appreciated.
Great. Thanks, Treasurer Pichak. Okay. I'd happily stay on for a little bit if there's other comments. We can also wrap this up if we're sort of at the end of the road here. Let me just check other things the folks would like to say before we finish up in today's conversation. I know that Marion also has a few concluding slides about next steps. But before we go to those, anything else folks want to put on the table before we talk about next steps? Okay, great. So Marion, walk us through what's going to happen, please.
Let me share my screen here. So we'll just echo, thanks so much, folks, for joining us on your lunch hour here to talk about the resilience implementation strategy. I'm going to share in a little bit more detail here what we're looking at in terms of the development of this strategy over the next 18 months or so, and share additional opportunities we're planning for public and stakeholder engagement so we can continue to engage with you all in this conversation. So at a high level, I'll walk through this slide with you. I know there's, a bunch of lines on here, but walk through the slide for you as it really depicts the high level objectives and outcomes and engagement opportunities we're planning as we develop this resilience implementation strategy. I see the process to develop the strategy broken out into three broad components. The first step is an inventory of existing plans and programs from across state government that have a connection to helping Vermont build resilience to climate change. We've started this work already and are going to be continuing to engage with our partners across state government on developing this inventory. We're calling it the opportunity assessment, and it will really allow us to get a full picture of what state government is doing to build resilience to climate change, and will then allow us to build and do a gap assessment so we know where there are places where we could be doing more. I think we heard from you all today some opportunities for additional support and additional ideas about how we can better support Vermonters in building resilience to climate change, and having a full picture and understanding of state government plans and programs will help us really inform that work. So this opportunity assessment will result in an inventory of what the state is doing to build resilience to climate change, and then will give us an understanding of where there are gaps. We're aiming to have this complete in the fall of this year, and we'll be conducting public engagement events on it late this year and early in 2025. We will also be building off today's conversation with you all, one we had on Monday as well, and others we are planning throughout the year to develop the vision for a climate resilient Vermont. We're aiming to have that complete in November of this year as well. We're also going to be doing, as I said earlier, a literature review, really looking at other conversations communities and partners have been having about climate resilience, knowing that this conversation we're having today is certainly not in a vacuum and there's a lot of ideas out there. We'll be building off that as well as the input you provided to develop a draft vision that we'll post online and have additional opportunities for engagement so that we can have that vision really input and share input and help craft the prioritization for the resilience strategy. The second phase of the resilience implementation strategy will be to take that inventory and gap assessment and work with stakeholders and the public to prioritize gaps and then identify the measures that are needed to fill those gaps. In many cases, this could mean an adjustment to program evaluation criteria or a change in the scale or scope of an existing state program. As noted earlier, there's a lot being done to build resilience. We may just need to adjust the scale or the scope of an existing program to better fit the needs, some of which have been identified through our conversation today. Gaps from that opportunity assessment will be prioritized using a set of criteria that will include the vision you all are helping to develop, and we'll then work with stakeholders to recommend measures needed to fill those gaps. Again, really getting to a place where we're understanding what are our most needs in terms of resilience, prioritizing those gaps, and then identifying with partners how to fill those gaps and how to better meet the needs to build resilience. We're aiming to have that work complete in the spring of next year, and we'll also be doing public engagement to review and provide input on those proposed recommendations. And then the last phase of this resilience implementation strategy will be working with the Treasurer's Office to understand the costs associated with implementing the recommendations that we've identified in phase 2. We know climate change is costly. It came up quite a bit in our conversation today. The July flooding alone was $1 billion disaster, and we know that building resilience will come at a cost as well. But we do also know that investing in climate resilience measures pays off in the long run. Research shows us that $1 invested yields at least $6 in savings when a disaster hits. And building resilience also means that our communities can feel more connected, can be healthier, and more prepared to deal with other shocks. Understanding that the costs needed to build resilience allows us to prioritize investments and really be strategic about the actions that we'll take to adapt to climate change. So the Treasurer's Office will be leading that cost analysis in the spring of next year, and we'll be working to hold public engagement events on that analysis in the spring of next year as well. So if you're interested in staying engaged with us as we embark on this process, and again, thank you for joining us today for the kickoff events, please sign up for the Climate Action Office's email newsletter. I believe there was an opportunity to do so when you sign up for the event today, but I think Sophie's going to put a link in the chat if you neglected to do so. This newsletter is shared regularly. It will include updates on our work, other work that the Climate Action Office is undertaking, and will also include information about future opportunities to participate in conversations with us on the development of the strategy. We'll also be posting future engagement opportunities and updates on the strategy work on our website, which is climatechange.vermont.gov. And then lastly, as I spoke to earlier, we are conducting a literature review of other events and conversations that communities have been having about climate resilience, what it means to them, and how we can think about it moving forward. If you know of a particular event or conversation that has material online that we can review, we'll be following up from today's event with an email and a survey link asking you to share that with us so we can ensure it's incorporated into our broader literature review. So with that, I'll just close and say thanks so much for taking time to share your thoughts and ideas with us today. It was a wide-ranging conversation, but I think really helps us think at a high level about how we value, place value and think about climate resilience in the face of the impacts we're feeling. This will help us better build systems and supports and processes to anticipate, respond to, and recover from the impacts of climate change. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, David, but thanks folks for sticking with us.
Thanks, Marion. That's really great. So in addition to signing up for the newsletter, checking out the calendar for events, expect from us a summary of what we've been hearing today and what we heard on Monday. Make sure we're capturing a lot of these views. That's it. I think we should finish up. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time, being willing to join us, and stay in touch. Take care, everyone. All the best. See y'all later.
Thank you, David.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.